Hello everyone! This video kinda popped up out of nowhere as I was doing research about the Unification War, and I thought that what was just a bunch of background characters and background settings essentially was created to be a speed bump for the Emperor turned out to be really cool and surprisingly detailed, and funnily enough having kind of a parallel to our own history. So, I've decided to share all of this and make a sort of a clarifying video about the Unification War. For now, we are just pausing the Emperor looking towards the galaxy and taking a deep dive look into what Earth was like at this point, what sort of warlords were running around creating chaos, and chaos was actually doing right now. So anyway, let's dive in. During the Age of Strife, that I will from now on be referring to as Old Night, civilization was initially not lost, but instead destroyed and reformed under incredible charismatic and terrible warlords. Instead of proclaiming and leading under the virtues of the golden age of technology, civilizations was centered around survival and savagery. Fueled by the creeping tendrils of chaos, this made the isolated humanity collapse into famine, plague, psychos, demonic incursion, and endless warfare. And let me point this out, this is a type of warfare that has no rules of engagement like in our world, and absolutely no limits on what weapons can be used. These conclaves and warlords would fight not only for resources required for survival, but every bit of scrap, tech, and prestige that survived the previous age. Meaning that this Mad Max era was fueled by atomic weaponry, power armored and gravity weapons, and other weapons that would redefine our understanding of what a war crime means. Alongside the fact that this is an age where untrained psychos were basically everywhere, meaning that magic and sorcery has effectively become reality within this barren wasteland. Mutants, cyborgs, demons, combat automatons and drug-fused madmen would slaughter and kill with impunity, and even the most civilized factions on the planet were still so brutal that if they were to exist within our world, we would unite as a planet in order to stop and kill them. Even the Emperor at this time would be considered a Techno-Barbarian warlord, but unlike the others, he had the foresight and knowledge to look beyond survival. While many petty despots roamed Terra at this point, there were a handful that proved an actual threat to the plans of Big E, and amongst those there were a few notable ones, and let's start along with Kalagann of Ursh. Ursh dominated the vast windswept steppes of what had been Russia, Siberia and Central Asia. And under Kalagann, this is what I'm gonna be calling him now, under Kalagann's Iron Fist, it became one of the most feared and savage techno-barbarian empires on Earth. This was no refined dictator hiding behind palace walls. Kalagann was a warlord who thrived in slaughter and brutality. He built his powers on rivers of blood and conquest without mercy, and a cruelty so absolute that even the later Imperium would remember him with a grim sense of respect. His armies simply didn't defeat their enemies, they effectively erased them, burning their villages, destroying their knowledge and inventions, and erasing whole cultures by grounding them beneath the threat of dark age of technology's war machines. Captured cities were put to the torch and their populations either slaughtered outright or dragged into his ranks as cannon fodder and slaves. Kalagann's warriors wore basic and primitive power armor that were decorated with the blood of the fallen and the kills of the soldiers, and they marched under a banner soaked in the gore of 100 fallen nations. When Ursh turns its eyes southward towards the technologically advanced North Africa conclaves, the wars that followed were apocalyptic. The imperial historians that at least have been judged to be trustworthy, describe seas that ran red with blood and a sky torn open with forgotten sorceries and terrible demons prowling the battlefield, summoned up by the psychos that Kalagann kept in his service like chained attack dogs. His forces used any weapon at their disposal, like atomic fire, chemical storms, gene-forged abomination, and even warp-born horrors that should not be. And during this war, the defeated population underwent mass executions, and entire regions of land was despoiled and rendered even more barren than what it had already been. Warriors following this man would take an almost worship-like joy out of all of this bloodshed, and Kalagann himself was considered almost like a god of war on the field of battle, wearing a true piece of technology from the Golden Age called the Armor of Pearl. This piece of war gear possessed an incredibly powerful refractor field, basically a force field barrier that would even break down incoming light, giving the illusion of being made out of pearl. Such an armor rendered him basically immune to anything that would be thrown at him that would not be mounted on a tank, and even a lot of this he could probably withstand. He would come to an end when the Emperor's gaze fell upon him. Kalagann's forces clashed with the Emperor of Mankind's Thunder Warriors in what became one of the defining confrontations of the early Unification Wars. The battle was a nightmare of psychic storm, demonic incursions, and warp sorcery clashing against bolts of blade and violence from the genetically engineered Thunder Warriors in a maelstrom of violence. But in the end, Kalagann failed. His empire of Ursh was broken and brought to heel. The Emperor claimed the Armor of Pearl as a trophy for it to be placed within his vaults, and here I do a bit of a speculation, but the Emperor's own armor is famous for having a refractor field that is near godlike, and I'd like to think that while he's not using the actual Armor of Pearl, then he might be using this very piece of technology, as the Emperor is not afraid of using the tools of his enemies. Another warlord that would prove quite a hassle would be Narthan Dume. Dume didn't inherit a stable kingdom. He seized it after the nightmare rule of another despot called the Unspeakable King, who by himself was a monstrous warlord whose atrocities were so vile that they are only spoken of in lost legends. However, if the people that had been under the Unspeakable King hoped for mercy and change now that they had a new ruler, they were in for a terrible surprise, as they were not freed from the Unspeakable King, but rather under new management. Dume ruled with an ironclad paranoia and cold calculation, as his empire formed itself into an efficient machine of oppression fueled by salvaged Dark Age of technology tech, allowing him to monitor his own people and enforce his will through heavily armored enforcers. He ordered brutal cleansings against any group that he would deem to be a threat, no matter of ideology or simply out of convenience. None was safe from the paranoia of this man, and entire populations vanished into labor pits, gene forces, and the execution yards simply at the whim of this warlord. Scholars and data archivists were especially threatened, as any usable knowledge was seen as a threat by Dume, and he conducted sweeping purges, burning libraries of implaceable knowledge lest anything spark a rebellion or inconvenient truth would pose a threat to him. However, even though much of this brutality was due to fear, Dume, I think I've called him several things now, let's call him Dume, and his warriors were no mindless berserkers like some steppe warlords. Dume was dangerously intelligent, as he understood power better than most at the time. He sought very little in a way of expansion, and he wished to truly isolate himself and his people from the rest of the world. And then there is an interesting question, and that is why the Emperor focused on killing him so soon. And here it even gets a little mysterious, as the law states that this warlord either knew or suspected some kind of truth about the Emperor, making him incredibly dangerous and marked for early destruction. Under Dume, the Pan-Pacific Empire became one of the final great obstacles to the Unification War, as his forces were no ragtag raiders, but were hardened Techno-Barbarians equipped with whatever forbidden relics and war machines that the Age of Strife had left behind. Their tactics would be to turn entire regions into kill zones and fighting a defensive way of war where hive spalls and fortress cities were held onto with fanatical resolve. While this made the Emperor's armies bleed for every inch of ground gained, even with all of his scheming and all of his intel, Dume underestimated the resolve and the brutality of the Thunder Warriors. And while the conquest of the Pan-Pacific Empire were among the hardest fights of the Unification War, it would happen in the Emperor's name. The Thunder Warriors were unleashed alongside mortal levies and countless mercenaries, fighting a grinding campaign across poisoned seas, ruined archipelagos, and continental sites of hive waste. Dume was captured alive, and the Emperor's inner circle argued for imprisonment in the nightmarish prison dungeon of Kambak Mavu, where other dangerous warlords were sent to rot forever. But Constantine Valdor, the Emperor's own Captain General of the Custodies, urged execution. Valdor saw within this man perhaps what others had missed, that this half-mad genius understood too much, and as long as Dume drew breath, he remained a symbol, a living challenge to the Emperor's vision, and so the tyrant of the Pan-Pacific Empire was executed. Another terrible fiend from this time was Dalmov Kun. Centered in what had once been ancient Brazil, now known as Sudamerica, the region of Brasil was one of the most densely populated powers left on the planet. Its sprawling hive city and fortress cantos and industrial heartlands teemed with billions of souls, all grinding under the merciless rule of Dalmov Kun. While other warlords like Kalagann reveled in open slaughter on the steppes, when Narthan Dume played his cold games of purge and paranoia across the Pacific, Kun ruled what could be considered a pressure cooker of humanity. With so many mouths to feed and so many bodies to throw into the mean grinder of endless war, his methods were ruthless as they were efficient, as Kun understood that in the Age of Strife, control meant crushing any spark of defiance before it could ignite. Rebellions in the lower hives were met with chemical purges and rat storms, and rivals that refused to bend the knees saw their territories starved and their water supplies poisoned, while their population were driven into brutal labor camps to fuel Brasil's war machine and endless need for production. His enforcers became legends of terror as they dragged dissidents into gene forces for unspeakable experiments and simply executed them en masse to keep the rest compliant, all while spreading radiation and poisoning against all that would defy them. This was a realm where strength was measured in how completely you could break people, and Kun would prove this by not only breaking his enemies, but their families, friends, allies, and supporters for coming generations. While other tyrants fell one by one, Dalmov Kun held out as he turned his densely packed hive into a nightmarish fortress where civilians were considered as much as a wall as those of steel. He hurled wave after wave of poorly armed conscript laborers and civilians against the Emperor's advancing armies, showing time and time again that for each Thunder Warrior that would fall, that he had plenty of bodies to spare. The fall of High Brasil was no clean victory. It was a campaign of slaughter that left the continent scarred for centuries. Yet, even in defeat, Dalmov Kun's bloodline endured, and the rule of Brasil passed to his direct descendants, Lord Sikar, who would rule in the interest of the Emperor, allowing him and his bloodline to continue ruling. And finally, on the list of real obstacles to Big E, we have Cardinal Tang. During the final and darkest centuries of Old Night, The Indonesian bloc stood as one of the most stubborn and horrifying powers on Broken Terror. This vast island-spanning empire, encompassing the shattered remains of Indonesia and all of surrounding archipelagos and most of Southeast Asia, this place became a theocratic nightmare under Tang's rule. While other warlords conquered with raw steel and sorcery, Tang conquered with sermons, genetic dogma, and rivers of innocent blood. He called himself Cardinal and Ethnarch, blending twisted religious authority with absolute ethnic and genetic control over his people. Tang was a zealot through and through, who understood the power of belief and faith, and he would preach that technology itself was the root of humanity's fall, and that Old Night was divine punishment for mankind's hubris in going against higher powers. Whether or not this is true is up to speculation. He dreamed of striking the world back to a pre-technological paradise, a simpler age ruled by faith alone. Yet this holy vision hid one of the most systematic campaigns of terror and eugenics Terror had ever seen. His regime was pure horror, as Tang imposed a genocidal breeding program across the islands of Indonesia, meaning that the citizens were forced into compatible matings dictated by priests and enforcers. Any union deemed genetically inferior was brutally punished, and entire bloodlines were burned out of humanity under his supervision. Children were murdered for being substandard, and enforced sterilization of entire villages were common punishment for going against this holy quest. Scientists and mathematicians, philosophers, and much more, and anyone who would clung on to the old technological knowledge were burned alive on massive pyres, and a few lucky ones were worked to death as knowledge itself became heresy. This was industrialized brutality wrapped in holy robes, a regime that turned its own people into raw material for a madman's vision of purity and stability, and so-called holy wars were waged against any neighbors of this warlord, meaning that no one was safe from Cardinal Tang and his followers. His warriors would fight with a righteous fury of those who truly believed that they were cleansing the planet of sin, and even as the Emperor's Thunder warriors carved their way across Terra, Tang continued with his purges, refusing to bend the knee to what he saw as another false unifier. In the end, Cardinal Tang was defeated and taken alive, like a handful of other previously mentioned tyrants. Some records suggest that in the nightmarish depth of the Kong Bao Mavu, the Supermax dungeon reserved for the worst of all night monsters, here he would lay and his regime crumbled, but the scars of the Indonesian regime lingered for centuries. These are just some of the more major Techno-Barbarians on Terra, but that by no means mean that this was all there was of civilization, as there were many countries and other things that are quite interesting, and even somebody who would end up becoming Big E's allies. For example, the country of Old Albia, located among the British Isles, was a land of towering soot-blackened castrum cities. These grim fortresses pierced the toxic skies, belching smoke from forges that would never sleep. These grim fortresses pierced the toxic skies, belching smoke from forges that would never sleep. And the people of Albia were hardened by endless wars, radiations, and the brutal struggle for survival. They were ancient warlike clans, forged in iron and fire, with a martial spirit that refused to die even as the world around them crumbled. Old Albia wasn't just another fractured state, it was a bulwark. The Albians frequently clashed with the distant hordes of the Pan-Pacific Empire under the tyrannical Unspeakable King, waging brutal wars across the dried-up remnants of the Atlantic Basin. They held their own with grim determination, buying their freedom with blood and ingenuity. These warriors marched in These warriors marched in salvage power armor, and they deployed steam-belching proto-dreadnoughts, crude but terrifying war-walking machines that shook the earth as they advanced. Their elite fighters, known as the Ironsides, earned a fearsome reputation as unbreakable shock troops who would rather die than yield an inch of their soot-stained homeland. And by the time that the Emperor of Mankind began his great campaign of unification, Albia had only recently thrown off the last remnants of the unspeakable king's tyrannical bloodline. They had tasted freedom through their own strength, and they had absolutely no intention of trading one master for another, which meant that when the Emperor's forces arrived, the Albians did what they had always done. They refused to kneel. Their proud clans met the Emperor's genetically engineered Thunder Warriors head-on in a series of savage attritional battles. Proto-Dreadnought clashed with superhuman killers, and Ironside soldiers in primitive power armor charged into the guns of the Emperor's finest. Battle after battle, the Albians held the line. They made the Thunder Warriors bleed, and the Emperor had his army staggered with a cause that he was not ready to soak up. The fighting was brutal, industrial, and unrelenting, a grinding war of wills between two forces that both refused to break. But the Emperor saw something within these warriors. He recognized their indomitable martial temper and their ancient pride and their unbreakable spirit. So, rather than exterminate them as he had done with others that resisted, he called for a ceasefire. And then came one of the most legendary moments of the entire unification war. The Emperor appeared before the assembled Albian clan lords, unarmed, dressed only in simple robes of white and crimson. No army, no Thunder Warriors at his back, just a lone figure offering a vision. A unified humanity, glory amongst the stars, and redemption from the long nightmare of old night. He spoke not as a conqueror demanding submission, but as a leader offering brotherhood to equals. And to the shock of many, even his own followers, the Warlords of Albia listened and accepted. They bent the knee, not out of fear, but out of respect. They saw in the Emperor something genuinely different from the tyrants who had come before, and in return, the Albion became some of the most zealous and loyal supporters of the newborn Imperium. And now we come to the land with the best name ever, and that's America. Not with an A, but with an M. Stretching across the shattered lands of what had been North America, America was defined by its sprawling hive cities, towering overcrowded megastructures that pierced toxic clouds and housed billions of souls in a constant struggle for survival. This was no small feudal kingdom or isolated steppe horde. America was a continental powerhouse, with its rulers commanding vast armies from fortified hive sprawls. Yet amid all of this desolation, America clung to a strange, almost defiant elegance. It became known across Terra for its high fashion and glittering ballrooms, islands of opulent decadence where the elite danced in salvaged silk and ancient finery, while the lower classes would choke on rat dust and famine. This contrast defined America. Brutal militarism wrapped in fading memories of a pre-strife grandeur, while columns of salvaged tanks and jury-rigged war machines and power armor enforcers rolled out from the hives. In the end, in a rare peaceful submission, they would too bend the knee to the Emperor. Then we have Germany, not to be mistaken with Germany. You know, there's obviously a clean difference here. Jesus Christ, Games Workshop. Germany endured as a relatively small but fiercely independent state. It occupied the territory of what had been Central Europe, the ancient lands of Germany. Again, not to be mistaken with Germany, but Germany, you know, obvious. Unlike the sprawling continental giants such as America or the teeming hordes of Ursh, Germany was compact, hardened, and built on stubborn martial traditions. Its people clung to the fragments of old discipline and engineering, knowing that such things would carry them through any hardship that they would come to face. They fortified their cities into grim strongholds, turning river valleys and industrial ruins into defensive webs though smaller than many of its neighbors, Germany was no easy prey. Its warriors earned a reputation for discipline, professionalism, and determined resistance, fighting with the resolve of those who knew that while they were small, they would have plenty of bite in them. As the Emperor's forces advanced, they met the defenders of Germany in brutal close-quarters warfare in enclosed trench networks and tunnels. One of the most storied episodes of this campaign was the defense of Stahlburg, the fortress of steel, under the great leader known as Storm King Erhard von Stahl. The warriors of Germany made their final legendary stands, where they hurled themselves against the Emperor's superhuman shock troopers with everything they had. Massed volleys from salvage cannon, desperate charges from armored elites, and bitter street-by-street fighting through the collapsing spires and manufactories of their capital. The Thunder Warriors smashed through the fences like a golden avalanche, yet Germany defenders fought on with fanatical courage, buying time with their lives and making their invaders pay dearly for every block. In the end, resistance crumbled and Stahlburg fell, while the proud banners of Germany were cast down and the Golden Raptor was raised on high. The tough, disciplined stock of Germany would feed into the growing imperial war machine, and their martial traditions quietly woven into the fabric of the new order. Now we have to talk about the Afric Conclaves. This was a very special place, as they preserved something quite precious here. True and easily usable fragments of advanced Dark Age of technology within their stronghold cities. These cities were built amongst the ruins of ancient Egypt, Libya, and the broader African coast, and it stood as a beacon of relatively sophisticated civilization amongst this global madness. They maintained functioning forges, preserved scientific knowledge, and they even fielded vast armies equipped with weaponry more sophisticated than most other factions, including the Emperor's own. This would come with a terrible price, because due to this level of technology and knowledge, the Conclave would become the target of basically any warlord with the resources to threaten it. And as I mentioned before, Ursh conducted an apocalyptic conflict here that would harm and ruin this place for generations. We're soon at the end here, and we just have to talk about the two coolest things so far. And one of them is called the Terowart Clan. While most Techno-Barbarians would wage endless war for expansion and resources, the Terowart Clan chose isolation. These mysterious forge lords, known as the, and bear with me here because we have established that 40k names and terms can be quite a mouthful, Theologitex. Alright. They ruled from deep within their mountain holes. There were technologists and philosopher engineers who guarded precious fragments of knowledge with fanatical zeal. Their great forges burned day and night, producing weapons and machinery that were among the finest available still on Earth. The Terowart Clan shared and revered the machine and the sacred mysteries of technologies for centuries, and they remained aloof for most of the planetary carnage that would unfurl, emerging only to trade their superior weapons to the highest bidder amongst the other warlords. However, everything changed when the Emperor came, and unlike the bloody conquests seen across Terra, the meeting with the Terowart Clan was one of the rare peaceful ones. The Emperor, recognizing their value, approached them not with the Thunder Warriors, but with gifts of lost technology and shared knowledge. In return, the Theologitex opened their forges exclusively to him. This alliance proved decisive, as progressively more and more advanced weaponry and equipment would now come in production from the Terowart Clan and flow into the Emperor's forces. And then, I might be biased here, but this is the coolest ones, because now we have to talk about the Nordics. Far in the north of dying Terra, in the shattered remnants of ancient Scandinavia, the region known as Nordic became home to some of the most horrifying chapters of Old Night. While other Techno-Barbarian realms would fight for land, resources, power, and ideology, the Nordic descended into something far worse: a slow, willing slide into utter damnation. At the heart of this frozen nightmare stood the Malut. At the heart of this frozen nightmare stood the Malut Zen Confederation. This confederation began as a desperate attempt by isolated communities to survive rat storms, mutation, and endless cold that seemed to become worse and worse and worse as each year passed. This led an enigmatic priest king into starting preaching and turning people to the most forbidden practices imaginable: cannibalism and human sacrifices. They used forbidden genetic technology and dark rites to create stronger warriors that would survive the apocalypse, offering up their children, their elders, and their enemies on blood-soaked altars, believing these horrors would grant them strength and protection. In truth, they had already become the unwitting pawns of the dark gods of chaos, with their rituals feeding the ruinous powers here on Terra. And now the dark gods would whisper promises of survival in exchange for even greater depravities. This was Old Night at its most nightmarish. Not just Techno-Barbarians with guns and armor and a need for survival, but an entire society that had embraced monstrosity, evil, and conducting themselves horribly with a conviction. When Big E learned of the corruption spreading in the north, he acted decisively. He paused all other current battlefronts and headed north with a large contingent of Thunder Warriors and Custodies. This would become one of his earliest and most personal campaigns during this unification war. They would advance through blizzard and frozen hellscapes towards the chaos-corrupted Confederation, and what followed was a battle remembered in grim legend as the Battle of Red Frost. On blood-stained ice, the Emperor's forces clashed with warp-twisted warriors and fanatical cultists of the Confederation ready for bloodshed. The fighting was savage, with the air reeking of blood and warp taint. The Priest King's forces fought with a frenzied strength of those who have already surrendered their humanity, and these abominations, while incredibly deadly and capable, they would not hold. The golden-clad Custodies would prove to be the winning factor in this battle, and the Priest King was captured alive, and in a final act of authority and contempt for those corrupted by chaos, the Emperor himself personally executed the Priest King using his flaming war sword. Whew! What a ride! As you can see, the Age of Strife is really complicated and there's a whole lot going on. I have really been reading into it, and this entire thing could be an entire setting of its own, which really just speaks to how big 40k is, as at this point we have still not left Earth and started conquering planets. So yeah, let me know if there was anything that you liked or you want to see more of, and the next video is going to be the Emperor looking towards the stars. Thank you very much for listening, and I'll see you in the next video. Bye bye!